Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, was the Organization of American States, the OAS, involved in the military coup against the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales? Our guest, Mark Weisbrot, co-director of CEPR, Center of Economic and Policy Research. Mark Weisbrot, a warm welcome to the program.
Thanks for inviting me.
Mark, your words regarding the military coup about Bolivia. You have said, I think this is a classic military coup supported by the United States.
Yes, well, I think that's true. I mean, here in the U.S., you actually have a kind of absurd debate over whether it's a coup or a military coup. But when the military tells the president to step down and then he resigns and flees the country, that's a military coup. You don't have to have a rifle pointed at his forehead on international TV to call it a military coup.
And you have written here in CEPR, in your organization, an article under the title of "The OAS Helped Drive Bolivia into a Crisis and Enable a Military Coup." And then another article written by you. The Organization of American States has deceived the public terribly on the Bolivian election. Why?
Well, they were really important in establishing a false narrative that probably most of the people who listen to or read the Western media believe. And that narrative started on day one, literally. It was the day after the election. The OAS put out a press release. It described the quick count of the vote, and we can talk about that later, what the quick count is. It's called the TREP count. Mm-hmm. And it said there was a pause after 84% of the votes were reported, which is true. And then it said when it resumed that there was, and they used the word, a drastic and hard to explain increase in Evo Morales' margin. And both of those words are false. It was not drastic and it was not hard to explain, and they had to know that because they had all the data.
You said the OAS misrepresented deliberately because they say 3 times, you mentioned, they never offer any evidence of that story about the preliminary reports.
Yes, and that's really striking because anybody who's ever watched on television an election return come in, you see this all the time. And there was a letter from economists and statisticians that mentioned the November 16th election in Louisiana, where the Democratic candidate was behind the whole time and then jumped at the end. And it was just, no one accused it of fraud. You know, it was just the last county that came in was 90% Democrat. But it wasn't even sudden in this case. That's the most outrageous thing. So they actually lied when they used the word drastic. And they repeated this 3 times. So it wasn't just their first press release, which was outrageous enough. I mean, it's quite outrageous to put out a press release when the votes aren't even counted yet, basically accuse the government of stealing the election. So it wasn't a drastic change at all. That's the first thing that anybody who has the data would know. And all 34,000 data points are on the web. So we downloaded it and looked at it. And you can see it was a very gradual trend. For many hours before this interruption, there was a steady increase in Evo Morales' margin over the second place finisher. And why was this? It was very easy to tell from the data. It's because the more pro-Evo Morales areas tended to come in later than the areas that were more for Mesa.
People who are not familiar with the geography of Bolivia, you have the Andes Mountains, very, very isolated areas, and a lot of people vote for Evo.
And you have poorer areas come in later, and rural areas come in later. So it's not every precinct like that, but it's strong enough so that you can easily do either an arithmetic analysis or a statistical analysis. We did both, and you can see that what happened after the interruption is very easily projected or predicted on the basis of what happened in the first 84% of the vote.
Then you said the media treats the OAS as an independent arbiter, and they have electoral missions, and most of the time they are clean, but not always. And you mentioned Haiti in 2011. But you mentioned definitely the OAS is under a lot of pressure of Senator Rubio and the Trump administration because they wanted for some time to get rid of Evo government. So
Yes.
basically, they went to the participation in the election already with an agenda?
Can't say with certainty who talked to whom, but it's so obvious that they lied repeatedly. And it's also obvious that the United States government, on the record, supported this coup very strongly. And so, yeah, if you put two and two together, I mean, OAS gets 60% of its funding from the U.S. government. And again, they've done it before under U.S. pressure. They did it in 2011, as you mentioned, in Haiti, and also in 2000. In 2011, the OAS coerced the government into accepting a reversal of their first round presidential election. And 2000 was even worse. That's what led to the coup in 2004. That was the fundamental basis of the United States and its allies cutting off desperately needed international aid from all over the world to Haiti, and resulted in the 2004 coup, where the U.S. was very directly involved.
In the newspaper La Jornada of Mexico, the professor Jorge Mahfoud at the Jacksonville University, he published a letter demanding the resignation of Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS. Tell me what you think about the role of Almagro in that coup d'etat, the military coup in Bolivia.
Yeah, he was much worse than the OAS Electoral Observer Mission, which put out the 5 statements that I told you about, 3 of which repeated the false narrative that the election was somehow stolen during that interruption in the trap count. He's got on television, or he was video speaking and repeating that he actually used the word fraud. The OAS didn't do that. They just strongly implied it and presented a narrative of fraud. He said that there was a fraud, and it was the October 20th election, and he used the word stolen several times. So he openly told this lie in a much stronger and outrageous way.
And do you think that he personally has an agenda in order to overthrow progressive governments in Latin America?
I don't know of all of them, but he obviously in Venezuela he's been on a jihad since he's been there. And I think that in this case, this could have been more of a crime of opportunity in this case, because, you know, first of all, he did support Evo's right to run for a 4th term, which other enemies of the Bolivian government didn't. And I think, you know, if I were just to guess, I can't say what's going on in his mind, but if you want my guess, I would say that he wants to be reelected. That's going to, you know, the election for Secretary General of the OAS is going to take place sometime between February and May. And so at first he wanted Bolivia's vote, and that's probably why he supported the right to re-election. But then I think when he saw that this was going to be a close vote, he thought that he could get more points with the Trump administration by helping this coup. I think he thought he needed that help because the State Department doesn't universally love him. They think he's kind of crazy, and he does exhibit very erratic behavior and speeches, and like this speech, just accusing this government of fraud, you know, without having any evidence at all.
And I did have the opportunity to interview Luis Almagro when he was a candidate for the secretary of the organization, and he was promising on camera that one of the things that he will never let was the re-election of the Secretary General. He told me that, and then it seems that he was turning 180 degrees.
Well, that's interesting. Well, you could say he's consistent. He doesn't care about term limits.
Mark, do you believe that the fact that the U.S. is paying 60% of the budget of the OAS has something to do with its structural problems?
I think that's part of it. But it's not the whole story. I mean, the U.S. is a very powerful country in this hemisphere, as you know. And now they have a number of right-wing allies that they didn't have a few years ago, you know. In this case, they had the government of Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Colombia,
Chile.
Chile. So they have a lot of allies in this, and they just have a lot of power. They can make all kinds of threats. If you ever talk to anybody who's an ambassador to the OAS, you know the kind of things they use, leverage, their people's visas, people's jobs when they leave the OAS. There's all kinds of things they can use to get the votes that they need. So it is a very serious structural problem, the control of the OAS, and it hasn't always been the same. Of course, when you had, in the peak of 2010, when you had left of center governments that were governing in the majority of the population of the hemisphere, the OAS was considerably better than it was now, but still pretty much manipulable by the U.S. So, for example, in 2009, there was the military coup in Honduras, and Hillary Clinton later wrote in her memoirs that she helped make sure that the democratically elected president, Mel Zelaya, would not be able to return to the country after the coup. And she did that partly by working with the OAS and successfully blocking the OAS from doing what the majority of its members wanted to do, which is provide very strong support for the return of the democratically elected president. And she did that, and she admitted it in her book. She took it out of the paperback, but it's in the hardcover edition. So that's the kind of thing that shows what a terrible structural problem we're dealing with. It means that anytime there's an issue of sovereignty in the Americas where the United States is involved in helping, and it's not like the U.S. creates these coups, there are always people within the country who want to get rid of any particular president. But when the United States intervenes, the OAS can be used as a weapon. And that's why in 2010, led by South American countries, they formed a new organization, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations.
Called CELAC in Spanish.
CELAC, yes. And they did that, I think, kind of obviously, in response to the U.S. manipulation of the OAS in the 2009 coup in Honduras. And that included, CELAC included everybody in the Americas, every country except the U.S. and Canada.
Exactly, except the U.S. and Canada, in order to create something that is an alternative. And what happened?
Well, what happened was when the United States regained control over all these countries that I mentioned, they started pulling out of CELAC. And of course, CELAC was not strong enough to be an alternative to the OAS at that, in the last few years, even at the peak. But it already had an influence in 2011 and 12, because what happened was it was a place where Latin American governments could meet without the U.S. and Canada, and they would come up with strategies to go into the OAS even and push for more pro-democratic outcomes.
I've seen you participating in recent days in different television programs regarding the coup, military coup in Bolivia. It was an occasion when you were participating in a roundtable with a representative of a think tank, Cato Institute here in Washington. Representative was Jan Vasquez. And his words were like a carbon copy of the rhetoric of the Grupo de Lima, the Lima group in the OAS, bashing left and right Morales, Bolivia, the repetitive words that they use on and on and on that has to do with the help of Almagro on the OAS, talking about bashing the election itself. Is there a consistent effort about different parts, different actors here in Washington in order to repeat the same rhetoric? Do they work together? There is a connection? How do they work?
No, they don't really need to collaborate because they all have the same views pretty much. And, in the United States, we don't really have an independent civil society on foreign policy issues. If you watch the largest TV stations here, everyone you see, almost everyone, not everyone, but almost everyone you see on television is either a U.S. government official, a former U.S. government official, or they're getting money from the U.S. government.
The official line almost.
Yeah, it is very bad. And now, that doesn't mean you don't get different points of view, because where there are different points of view within the so-called national security state, the 17 intelligence agencies, the State Department, the Pentagon, National Security Council, and so on, there's debate, you know, so on Afghanistan and Iraq, you'll see different views. But on Latin America, it's much more uniform than it is on any other region of the world. And that's because there's almost no disagreement within the national security state and the rest of the so-called foreign policy establishment. They all kind of see it in very primitive Cold War terms, that, you know, we're fighting, and they wouldn't say we're fighting to keep control over the region, but they generally support almost any policy, you know, even in this case, a military coup, if it benefits the United States' control over any country.
Do the media, mostly referring to Latin America, be fair and balanced, or absolutely they're pushing people, manipulating minds in order to hate certain governments or certain presidents of those governments?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to exaggerate it. It's not monolithic. There are always individual reporters who are trying to do their jobs. A lot of them, I've seen a lot of them fired or transferred for doing that over the years. I mean, I've been dealing with the media for the last 20 years on these issues. So there are definitely pockets of people who want to give a balanced view. You know, for instance, even in Venezuela, which is among the most biased coverage you can find, you know, right after the referendum in 2004, for example, where they suddenly discovered that Chavez had a lot of support. They hadn't seen that because all the polling was done by, basically they were fake polls. There were times where they actually tried to include other points of view. Now they don't even really try. If you look at the articles, you see you don't even get a random academic, you know, in the major outlets saying, and you can find lots of academics who will give another side to the story in a lot of these things. And most of the time, almost all the time, they don't even bother right now. This is a particularly bad period. I mean, I don't think this is going to last.
And this is a bad period for Latin America in terms of what we've seen. We've seen the uprising of the repression in Chile, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Colombia, people going to the streets just against the neoliberal recipe that mostly they are killing their everyday lives, and what they're getting back is repression, and on top of that, bashing, because the official lines, that they are not people claiming for the rights, are vandals.
Yeah, you do see terrible report. I mean, you know, Ecuador is a good example. If you look at all the repression that's taken place there, and institutional changes as well, that really make it much less democratic and weaken, undermine the rule of law. It's quite strong, and you've seen almost nothing about that in the media. But I think the part that's really underreported the most is when the United States plays a role anywhere. So, you know, the U.S. was involved, for example, openly in helping the so-called parliamentary coup, the coup against Dilma in Brazil. You had, for example, the Secretary of State Kerry went there and made a big speech right before the Senate was going to vote to remove her from office, and saying how he was looking forward to the great relations they were going to have with Brazil. And he was there with the acting foreign minister, José Serra. And there were a couple of things like that where they made very clear statements that gave everybody in the Brazilian government who was thinking about whether they should support this coup a clear indicator that the United States supported. And they also had the U.S. Department of Justice involved. And there was a letter from Congress recently about that in the Lava Jato investigation, and they're asking, you know, members of Congress want to know what they did, what else they did to support this coup. And I can go through country by country, you know, we don't have time. But, you know, you could look at Argentina and what they did to the Cristina Fernandez before she lost her election narrowly.
For you, as an expert, worrisome times for Latin America with the U.S. putting their nose or not in the process of that region?
It's been pretty consistent. You know, there wasn't much change from Bush, the 8 years of George W. Bush, to the 8 years of Obama. I think the only...
What about Trump?
But Trump, I think, there's a significant difference there.
For the worse or for the better?
For the worse, because it's more aggressive and violent. I mean, the sanctions against Venezuela, I mean, this is a very deliberate strategy. They're targeting the civilian population of Venezuela, killing them, depriving them of medicines and medical.
Your study reports 40,000 people?
Yeah, it's definitely in the tens of thousands. I mean, that wasn't meant to be a narrow estimate, but it's in the tens of thousands of people that have died from the cutoff of of medicines, medical equipment, infrastructure, public health infrastructure for water. All those things kill people, and they know it. And if you look at Pompeo's actual statements, you can see that the purpose is to make people suffer so that they will, either the military or the people will bring down the government.
Perverse?
It's pretty sick, yeah. But I think that, you know, if you want to look at the differences, this is something that is more aggressive and more violence prone from, you know, the threats of military action as well of the Trump administration.
Mark Weisbrot, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.